Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and the author of The Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. Today he's with us from Tucson in Arizona. Can I start by getting your thoughts, Antony, on this latest attack in Gaza?
It's devastating, and it's at least the fourth time that something like this has happened, where huge numbers of Palestinians who are constantly moved around are sheltering in schools and are attacked by Israel. There's no safe place in Gaza. There's not been really any safe place in Gaza since October the 7th last year. And it's interesting, it's literally happening on the same day that it was announced that the US was sending $3.5 billion more of military support to Israel. And it almost seems as if there are no red lines, as there's not been for 10, 11 months now. So it's devastating. And ultimately, without massive international pressure, once again, this will not change. And Kamala Harris, who obviously is now campaigning for president here in the US, is feeling a bit of pressure, correctly, for potentially saying that she needs to change her position. Otherwise, she will not correctly get a lot of people's support who are disillusioned with Biden, correctly so.
We see her perhaps trying to distance herself from President Biden in terms of rhetoric, but the substance of the policies remains the same. It's safe to say that she would do nothing to end or even challenge things like the $3.5 billion that's just been given to Israel by the United States to spend on US military and weapons on top of the $3 billion it already gets from the United States annually.
Well, there's no indication of that. And it's worth saying that, of course, that the position of pretty much any senior Democrat for years is very, very blindly pro-Israel. And I would say it's pro-apartheid rather than pro-Israel. And that's because, for a range of reasons, because of the often older nature of the Democratic donors, often very pro-Israel, very hardline Zionist donors that support the Democratic Party. But the problem really that Israel has is that, in the end, its position within the Middle East has never been more insecure. There are multiple fronts opening up from Iran to Lebanon and elsewhere, the Houthis in Yemen, and there's no real sense that there's any plan to move forward. Despite that, just this week, there was a new poll in Israel that found Netanyahu was once again the most popular Israeli politician after a few months of being less popular. So ironically enough, when there's more international pressure on Israel or criticism on Netanyahu as well, his popularity goes up. In the last week, as we've seen, the amounts of visual evidence of Israeli soldiers raping Palestinians in Israeli prisons since October the 7th. And the sad reality is that public opinion within Israel, many, of course, do not agree with or support that, to be clear, but a sizable proportion do. And it's that kind of, it's often hard to think of the right word to describe exactly the state of Israeli society. There is a pro-war fever still to this day, and frankly, an appetite for potential war against Iran or Hezbollah, which would be insane, because Israel is a very small country with actually a relatively weak and depleted military after 10, 11 months in Gaza.
It is interesting that despite the deterioration in the sort of security conditions, there is an appetite or at least confidence in confronting a regional power like Iran inside Israel. But can we say the same thing about Washington, that while they try to always assert and emphasize their support for Israel, does Washington really want to become embroiled in a wider Middle East war?
Well, logic would dictate no, and certainly the US has said that they don't, but wars just don't suddenly not happen because you don't want them to happen. It requires major action and pressure, and all I'm hearing from my sources is the pressure at the moment from the US is not on Israel, it's on Iran, for not striking back after the recent killing of a Hamas leader in Tehran recently. So, ultimately, the US could be complicit and involved in any kind of regional war. I don't necessarily think that the US wants to get involved in a regional war. The history of US wars in the Middle East in the last 20 years has been disaster upon disaster. The US is frankly incapable, or Israel for that matter, of actually winning any wars. An insurgency never benefits the larger power. We've seen that from Vietnam onwards. And yet the idea that we seem to be moving inevitably to some kind of regional conflict without massive pressure, and frankly, where, by the way, are many of the European states? Where are some of the more powerful Arab states putting massive pressure on Israel? I don't see that pressure or hear that pressure. And I think without that, Israel feels that they're off the leash and can behave as they want.
OK, thank you very much, Antony Loewenstein, for joining us from Tucson in Arizona.